welcome again, everybody, to another program of Searching for Answers. We would encourage you to get your Bibles and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and read along with us as I think it's verse 9 too, isn't it?
Well, verse 3, we want to review a little bit maybe.
Okay, we'll go back to verse 3 to do a little review, and I'm going to ask our good friend John Jones to read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning with
Verse 3. Verse 3.
verse 3.
Yes, well,
Okay.
here's Paul. Paul's feeling a little defensive here, isn't he? You know?
Yes.
He says, "Hey, people, you all want to drill down on me, and get after me. I'll give you a few words." So he allows himself a judicious kind of comeback. Already in the first couple of verses, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle?" So then in 3 he says, here's my defense. Here's the deal. Don't we have a right to our own food and drink? That's a kind of a basic human right, isn't it? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. And don't we have the right to be accompanied by a sister as a traveling companion? You can translate that as you wish.
Mine says believing wife.
That's the new RSV.
Okay.
As do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas. In other words, it looks like traveling evangelists here do have a bit of a retinue. Indeed, back when we were doing Acts, you remember, Paul speaks of his travels on the way back to Jerusalem, and he goes into Asia Minor, and he picks up a crowd a little group, who travel with him as long as he's within that province of Rome. So this may be kind of standard operating procedure. Or rather, he says, is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Yeah? In other words, apparently Paul and Barnabas are both earning their keep as they go. We know that Paul was a Pharisee. We know that they were required to have trade. They were supposed to be able to earn their living with their hands. So Paul is certainly able to do that as a tent maker, which may have included mending fishing nets and things. But Barnabas apparently has also been careful to support himself through his own physical labor along the way. Others apparently are claiming that by virtue of their authority and position in the church, they are entitled to a certain amount of support so that they don't have to do this.
Right.
And so who at any time pays the expenses for doing military? If you're a soldier, do you cover your own wages? No. Right, that's the implied answer, isn't it?
Well, now is the situation that there is this practice of apostles moving with a group, and if you're not moving with a group, then there's a question whether you're a real apostle. Is that as simple as that?
I don't think it's
I
that,
never
but it's
heard
that he has a right to do certain things,
Yeah.
but he doesn't exercise those things.
Yeah.
And this is really a tie-in with chapter 8. He has a right, as the Gentiles of this church have, to eat this food offered to idols, because there's no idol God, but don't use it if someone could be hurt by it. So there are certain rights that are inherent in the situation of a Christian, and here in this case of an apostle, but he's going to say, I don't use the kinds of rights that I have.
But he seems to imply that he has a right not to work.
But he's not exercising that right.
Okay.
He is implying that he, like the others, could disdain, not work,
Well, claim their support.
Yeah, claim their support. But he's saying, but Barnabas and I are the exception to the rule. We taken care of ourselves. This clearly was a problem in the early church. No question about it.
Itinerant.
Absolutely.
preachers.
You may have talked about this. The teaching of the 12 apostles, known as the Didache, that's the Greek title.
Early second century.
Early second century, one of the earliest of the church manuals, spends some time, several paragraphs, touching on aspects of this problem. What do you do with traveling evangelists? To what extent can they lay claim to your support? To what degree are you obliged to take care of them? And it comes up with its own answer, which is kind of interesting. It says, well, first of all, you should only host them for 3 days. And furthermore, when it's time for them to leave, send them on their way with just enough bread to make it to the next city, no more. And by the way, if they ask you for money, they're a false prophet. So well, here's the church already struggling with these very questions that are going on here. So picking up with Paul's discourse, who plants a vineyard without getting any fruit of it, yeah? Who tends a flock and doesn't get any of the milk? And so he says, look, this is not human authority. I may be arguing from culture, but it's not culture that backs me up here. It's the law of Moses. You shall not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. This is out of the Pentateuch. You know?
That's from the law of Moses.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is interesting too, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Well, do you want analogy, you want us to read then from verse 8 on, Carolyn, somewhere here?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Shall I read it?
Yeah.
Do I say this on human authority? Does not the law also say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, and he's going to quote Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. Here's what Deuteronomy 25 says. You shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Now, without going any further, you see, there was a humane interest to care for the animals. They had a right to eat. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Paul, he knows what it says, but he's going to do something different with that. Verse 10. Or is it for oxen that God is concerned? And I want to shout, yes! In the Old Testament it was. Or does he not speak entirely for our sake? So Paul sees it as having direct application to him and to his ministry along with Barnabas. They have a right to their pay, you might say. All of this is built up just to say, but I don't use it.
Yeah, that's right.
Once you've built it up, then he says, but I don't use it. And he gives the reason why later, as we'll see.
Yeah.
Paul knows this well. He uses it again in the first letter to Timothy. Quotes the same thing about not muzzling an ox, and puts it alongside another quotation, the labor is worthy of his hire, deserves to be paid.
Mm-hmm. We deserve to eat, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
It isn't just the oxen that can eat.
Shall I start with 10?
You shall.
Surely, he says, this is for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? Now there's your argument.
There it is.
There it is.
But you know what's interesting about this?
What?
The Corinthians believed in the patronage system. Paul was their patron. They actually would like to have supported him, and then in a sense, he feels that that would kind of put him under their thumb, so to speak, and he won't take it.
Right.
But he has a right to it. That's what he's arguing for now. He has a right to it.
So there's a sort of an argument over the nature of the church. And he wants the authority of the itinerant spiritual leader, right? He doesn't want to be tied down by any one of these little churches that he's being set up. Right.
No one directs his evangelism, his ministry.
Is he talking about being paid?
At least supported in some sense.
Yeah.
Is he saying, well, you support this one, but the two of us, we don't have any support?
And that's why I think back in verse 6, he does want to assert a right not to be under them. When he says, if we don't want to take money, we have a right not to. If we want to be independent of you, we have a right to be independent. But we're still in charge because we're apostles and I've seen the Lord.
Yeah.
But he also says, or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? See?
Yeah.
They're still doing tents and all that, I guess.
That's right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, they wouldn't have had to,
No.
but they chose to. And
But I
that's
think
why-
you're absolutely right. There's a tension about who's in charge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, so often isn't this interesting? We see him repeatedly, not only here but elsewhere, writing to his church members, my beloved children, He writes to them in this kind of paternalistic, if not patronizing style. You know, my children, I feel toward you as if I were, paraphrasing now, your uncle or your father or something. And he doesn't want that inverted. You
Right.
know?
Right.
Yeah, he wants
Right.
he wants to maintain that. Yeah.
That'll come up very strongly in a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, Ivan, would you continue
Well,
on?
in the second half of verse 12, I'll start
Okay.
from there. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ.
Well, let me tell you what mine says. Verse 12, if others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
go ahead.
All the more. So now he reverts, though, again to the rights that he should have.
Yeah.
He could claim. Verse 13, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? And those who serve at the altar share in what is sacrificed on the altar?
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I'm going to read verse 15 because it follows right on. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing this so that they may be applied in my case. I'm not asking you to give me something. I'm
Yeah.
asserting, though, you owe it to me, but I'm not asking for it.
Not asking for it, but I want you to know I realize you're not giving us anything.
Indeed, I would rather die than that no one will deprive me of my ground of boasting. I have a ground of boasting, and I don't want anyone to deprive. Now, the question is, what is this ground of boasting? And he will define what that is.
He's foregoing.
In just a second. Should I just keep
Sure.
a little more?
Yeah.
Verse 16. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground of boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I don't proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, if I'm not doing it of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? Just this, and here comes the punchline.
Okay.
That in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel.
So as not to make use of my rights in preaching it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
His rights would be getting support.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think he's got a particular reason. People have been dissing him as an imposter, a charlatan, someone maybe less than fully an apostle, but who's taking advantage of his position in some way. And he wants to say slyly, by implication, if anybody's taking advantage of their position, it's those other people. It's not me.
But isn't he setting himself up as the example? That is to say,
Yeah.
he has rights, but he's not going to use it. Because in chapter 8, he's been telling his people, sure, you're right,
Yeah.
but don't use that to put other people down.
Right.
And he's saying, I have rights, but that doesn't mean they have to be exercised.
Right.
Take a lesson, you Corinthians.
Yes, that's right. Well, those strong in Corinth, they were determined to do their thing no matter what, whether a weak person was hurt or not.
Yeah.
The assertion of their rights was an assertion of their spiritual dignity in their minds.
Right,
In their minds.
right.
And Paul just, he would do away with that altogether here. Yeah. To make the gospel free of charge. That's where it's at.
Okay, you want to continue?
Well, for though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them.
Mm-hmm.
To the Jews, I became as a Jew. He lived like a Jew, looked like a Jew. Well, he was a Jew.
Okay.
In order to win the Jews. In other words, he kept the Jewish lifestyle
Yes.
going. To those under the law, this is also about the Jews, I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, now these are the Gentiles, I think, I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. And that almost reminds me, like, I have a right to be supported by you, and I don't accept it, but I do what I do free of charge, so that I might have the blessings of the gospel itself.
Well,
What you don't give me, I don't take from you, I get from the gospel.
He's coming back to metaphors that he used in the previous chapter, strong and weak, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's using a lot of free and slave. Well, he's free in some senses. He's a slave in other respects. He's strong in some senses, but he's made himself weak. You know, come on, Corinthians, think a little bit.
Yeah.
See the complexity of life.
That's right. He adapts himself to whatever situation and to whatever people he's dealing with.
Would you read from verse 20 on to the end?
I'll be glad to.
Okay.
Once again, we see that Paul is sensitive to being accused of being a man-pleaser, who says easy things in order to gain acceptance. And just in a quick passing footnote before we read on, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 17, we, this is the kind of plural of his position, we are not peddlers of God's word like so many are. He's implying that there are other people who really do behave in ways that he's accused of, but he says, not me, not
That's
us.
right.
You know,
That same thing comes up in 1 Thessalonians. He talks about the same thing.
Yes.
A lot of charges were made against Paul,
apparently.
really.
Yeah, so here we are now in chapter 9, picking up the paragraph begins typically in most translations with verse 19, but I'll jump in with 20. To the Jew, let's see, I think we've touched on
19,
that, haven't we?
that's all right.
Okay. I'm free with respect to all. I made myself a slave to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, as a Jew, in order to win Jews. Those under the law, I became as one under the law, that I might myself, though I myself am not under the law. I might
What does
win
he
some.
mean there?
Well, I think he means that in Christ, we're no longer obliged to kind of try to earn our own righteousness through legal obedience of the law.
Well, and he doesn't
that
have to
way.
live as a Jew. He
doesn't
wouldn't
live
have
as a
to,
Jew,
but he
yeah.
chooses to live as a Jew at times.
So to those outside, I became as one outside the law. Though I'm not free from God's law, I'm under Christ's law, that I might win those outside. To the weak I became weak, win the weak, become all things to all people, I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. So that kind of rounds off that thought, doesn't
Right.
it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So now, the final paragraph. Don't you know that in a race, everybody's, the runners, they all compete, but only one receives the prize? Now, this is another metaphor.
Oh, it's a whole series of sports metaphors coming up.
Yeah. So run in such a way that you may actually win it. Strive forward. Verse 25, athletes exercise self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we, an imperishable one. Acanthus leaves, ivy, which only was wilted by the end of the day, So I don't run aimlessly, just putting on a show. Nor do I kind of box as though I were beating the air, kind of shadow boxing or something.
He moves as fast from one sport to
Yeah,
another
yeah,
as
bang, bang, bang.
ESPN, I think.
Yeah, right. That's well said. But I punish my body and enslave it. The Greek there means I keep it down. I keep it under control.
Well, this is what athletes have to do,
Yeah, sure. Yeah. The discipline.
the discipline, yes.
So that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified, or actually the Greek word is ashamed, that I not be ashamed or put down in some way.
Yeah.
But now how does these collection of metaphors from the races of the Olympiad, let's say, and also the boxing, how do they relate to the overall issue that came before?
I think he is saying, in effect, it's possible to be a pretender. of an imposter, as he's accused of being. But he is saying the very fact that I forego the benefits that an imposter would gladly reap from being a pretender means that I am sincere and serious, that I live a life of discipline, not a life of self-indulgence, that I am focused, and I'm not just putting on a show.
So these are pictures of athletes who impose discipline on themselves, right? Not because they have to, but because they want to. They're participants in this race. And I suppose he's saying the same thing to these strong people of chapter 8. Yeah. Sure, you're strong, but strong people exercise self-discipline.
Well, see, when you speak of self-discipline there, see, he exercised the discipline preceding this by not using his rights.
Right.
See, he's like, in doing this, he's like these athletes. Mm-hmm. See, he's carrying on his apostleship, but he's doing so in a way that puts himself down. He's not trying. The Corinthians are sort of jutting out. Their spiritual elitism is making them do all kinds of strange things, and certainly not care about the weaker members of the church. And he's an athlete who's under discipline, and he's willing to punish his body like an athlete does.
Yeah, and you people who claim to be strong, remember, athletes use their strength carefully. They're disciplined in their use of strength.
That's right.
You claim to be strong, act like it.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
That's Paul, not me.
Okay, would you carry on, please?
Chapter 10. Mm-hmm. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness.
Now this is what he's gonna do is he's gonna go to the story of Israel. And Israel had many, we'll not call them rights so much, but let's call them blessings. They were baptized in Moses in the cloud and the sea. So baptism, you get an image of baptism. There's an Old Testament baptism. And then they ate all this same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. That's correspondent to the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. They had, in the Old Testament times, they had the equivalents of these Christian events of baptism and the Lord's Supper. So now, look at what happened to them. You're making great claims. It must be behind the scenes here that the Corinthians thought. Yeah. We're baptized. Yeah. We eat the Lord's Supper, like in the 2nd century, Ignatius says, he calls the Lord's Supper the medicine of immortality. Mm. And so they think that perhaps by imbibing these things, they're sort of automatically saved, And he's going to challenge that in a very strong way here. In fact, they even baptize for the dead, as 1 Corinthians 15 is going to say. They have a view of baptism like that. Yeah, they baptize for the dead. So they see these rites as possessing some kind of super power.
Almost magical.
Almost magical. Mm. And I think guaranteeing their salvation. Yeah. And Paul is saying, but look at Israel.
But now, he says, our brothers and sisters, our ancestors. So these must be people who have had some sort of affinity or appreciation, at least, of the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, well, they've got the Old Testament, which is their Bible. It's their only Bible, okay? And so they're being piped constantly, and he's constantly quoting the Old Testament in order to foster his teachings. So this is very important to them.
Mm-hmm. That would apply both to Jewish Jews, ethnic religious Jews, and it would probably apply also to some of the God-fearers who were attracted to Judaism.
Right.
Had perhaps for years been sitting in the synagogue, identified in some way with the ancient text and these people. So in either way, it resonates for them, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
But even if they weren't a God-fearer, as Gentiles, they pipe into the Old Testament and into the history of the Old Testament. And Paul says, this Old Testament that all of us share in common is really instructive for your situation. Look at Israel. They had great privileges, but what happened to them?
It's not enough to say that we're the chosen. And
No.
it's not enough to say that you're the,
That's
the
right.
Christian chosen.
Exactly. Exactly.
This is knowledge, people who have a knowledge of history, just as in chapter 8, there are people who have knowledge
Yeah.
Yes.
that are puffed up because of that knowledge.
Yeah. Well, here, he would like them to have this knowledge, I think.
I don't want you to be ignorant.
Yeah. Well, if we go from verse 6, we get the whole point of it all. Shall we carry on from verse 6? Oh, we're coming to the end. Well, just begin, and we're at the end.
Boy, it went very fast, I'll tell you. What would you say is the leading subject that we have been taking from chapter 9 and 10? Quickly, we have just about 56 seconds.
Well, the 9 is he gives up his rights. That's the leading thought. As the strong in chapter 8 are advised to do if it will cause someone to stumble. So give up your rights, because in doing that you show true freedom. True freedom.
Right. Okay, do you have something to say? You got 30 seconds.
Well, I think he's saying, follow my example.
Okay.
And he's along the way established that he's an apostle and they ought to take him seriously, and this is how he acts, and they should be too.
And what about you?
It's not automatically magical that we get saved by being God's children. Rather, it has to do with our inner faith.
Right.
All right, and with that thought, we have 7 seconds left. My name is Carolyn Thompson, and till next time, keep searching.